The thunderous crack of Judge Harmon's gavel echoed through the cramped, sweltering courthouse in Redemption Springs, Arizona Territory, 1879, as Violet James stood in stunned silence, her wrists bound by iron shackles that felt heavier than the weight of the accusation hanging over her head. The crowd behind her erupted in angry whispers, their judgment already passed before the trial had properly begun. Murder, they said, cold-blooded murder of the town's most prominent businessman, Edward Walsh. Order, I will have order in this court. Judge Harmon bellowed, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. His weathered face, lined with years of passing judgment in this lawless territory, showed no emotion as he stared down at Violet. Miss James, you stand accused of the murder of Mr. Edward Walsh. How do you plead? Violet raised her chin, her honey-brown eyes flashing with defiance despite the fear that threatened to choke her. At 22, she had never imagined she would be fighting for her life in a courtroom filled with people who had once greeted her with friendly smiles. Not guilty, Your Honor, she replied, her voice clear and unwavering. I did not kill that man. Another wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Judge Harmon slammed his gavel again, his patience visibly thinning. The prosecution may present its case, he announced, gesturing to Andrew Parker, the town prosecutor whose ambitious nature was well known throughout the territory. Parker stood, adjusting his spectacles with a practiced movement. Your Honor, the evidence against Miss James is substantial. She was found at the scene, her hands covered in the victim's blood. The murder weapon, a knife from her own kitchen, was discovered nearby. Multiple witnesses can attest to hearing her threaten Mr. Walsh just days before his murder when he refused to extend the loan on her father's property. Violet's hands trembled. It was true she had argued with Walsh. The whole town had heard their heated exchange when he'd informed her that he was foreclosing on her father's ranch after his death, leaving her homeless and penniless. But she hadn't killed him. She'd found him, already dying, when she'd gone to make one last desperate plea. Furthermore, Parker continued, satisfaction evident in his tone, Miss James stood to gain considerably from Mr. Walsh's death, as the foreclosure proceedings on her property would have been delayed indefinitely. That's a lie, Violet couldn't stop herself from crying out. I gained nothing. The bank still holds the note. Silence, Miss James, Judge Harmon warned, his eyes narrowing. You will have your turn to speak. The makeshift defense attorney assigned to her case, a young, inexperienced man named Timothy Wells, who appeared to be barely out of law school, rose nervously to his feet. Your Honor, while circumstances may appear suspicious, there is no definitive proof that my client committed this crime. She has no history of violence, and the evidence is entirely circumstantial. She was found with the body and the weapon, Parker countered smoothly, and she had ample motive. Judge Harmon nodded gravely. Indeed. Does the defense have any witnesses who can testify to Miss James's whereabouts at the time of the murder? Timothy Wells shifted uncomfortably. We are still gathering testimonies, Your Honor. Violet's heart sank. She knew what that meant. No one was willing to speak on her behalf. After her father's death 3 months prior, she had become an outsider in Redemption Springs, a woman alone trying to run a struggling cattle ranch in a man's world. People were suspicious of her independence, her refusal to accept marriage proposals from men who were more interested in her land than in her. Very well, Judge Harmon said, disappointment evident in his tone. The trial will commence in 3 days' time. If the defense cannot produce any witnesses by then, we will proceed with the evidence at hand. As the bailiff moved to lead Violet away, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly swung open with a bang that made everyone turn. A tall figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, his broad shoulders and the distinct shape of a cowboy hat instantly recognizable even before he stepped into the light. Dust from the trail still clung to his long coat, and the jingle of his spurs accompanied each deliberate step as he moved forward down the center aisle. Yates Ellison. Violet recognized him immediately, though they had spoken only a handful of times since his arrival in town 6 months ago. A cattle driver who had decided to put down roots, buying a small spread that bordered her father's land to the north. He kept to himself mostly, but she'd seen him occasionally in town, always polite but distant. "Your Honor," Yates called out, his voice deep and steady as he removed his hat, revealing sun-streaked brown hair. "I'll testify for her." The courtroom erupted once more, but this time in shock rather than anger. Judge Harmon banged his gavel repeatedly. "Mr. Ellison, this is highly irregular," the judge admonished, though curiosity colored his tone. "Begging your pardon, Judge," Yates replied, his blue eyes never leaving Violet's stunned face. "But I believe Miss James is innocent, and I have information that might help prove it." Parker stepped forward, his face flushing with anger. "Your Honor, we cannot allow random interruptions to these proceedings. Mr. Ellison should follow proper channels if he wishes to provide testimony." Judge Harmon studied Yates, taking in his steady gaze and resolute stance. "Mr. Ellison, are you willing to swear under oath that your testimony is truthful and relevant to this case?" "I am, Your Honor," Yates confirmed, finally breaking his gaze from Violet to look at the judge. "Very well," Judge Harmon said after a moment's consideration. "You will be deposed by both counsels before the trial. Bailiff, please take Mr. Ellison's information." As the bailiff approached him, Yates glanced once more at Violet, giving her a slight nod. In that brief exchange, Violet felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death: hope. The days leading up to the trial passed in a blur of anxiety for Violet. Confined to a small cell in the town jail, she had little to do but worry about her fate and wonder about Yates Ellison's unexpected intervention. She had exchanged fewer than a dozen words with the man in all the time he'd been in Redemption Springs. What could he possibly know that would help her case? On the morning of the third day, Timothy Wells visited her, looking slightly more optimistic than he had during their previous meetings. "I spoke with Mr. Ellison yesterday," he informed her, lowering his voice even though they were alone. "His testimony could change everything." "What did he say?" Violet asked, leaning forward eagerly. Timothy shook his head. "I can't discuss the details yet. But he seems confident, and his story holds up under questioning." The prosecutor was quite frustrated by the end of the deposition. A small smile tugged at Violet's lips. She could imagine Parker's annoyance at having his seemingly straightforward case complicated. Why is he doing this? She couldn't help asking, "We barely know each other." Timothy shrugged. He said it was the right thing to do, said he couldn't stand by and watch an innocent woman hang for something she didn't do. Before Violet could respond, the door opened, and the sheriff appeared to escort her to the courthouse. As she walked the short distance between the jail and the courthouse, Violet held her head high despite the stares of townspeople lining the street. Some looked hostile, others merely curious, but a very few offered encouraging nods or sympathetic glances. The courtroom was even more crowded than it had been during the preliminary hearing. It seemed everyone in Redemption Springs and the surrounding areas had turned out to witness the trial. Violet scanned the faces as she was led to her seat beside Timothy, searching for Yates. She found him sitting near the back, his expression unreadable as their eyes met briefly before she was instructed to face forward. Judge Harmon called the court to order, and the proceedings began. Parker presented the prosecution's case first, calling several witnesses who testified to Violet's argument with Walsh and her desperate financial situation following her father's death. The town's doctor confirmed that Walsh had been stabbed multiple times with a kitchen knife. The same knife found near his body, a knife that matched the set in Violet's kitchen. Sheriff Miller testified next, describing how he had found Violet kneeling beside Walsh's body in the man's office, her hands and dress stained with blood. She claimed she'd found him that way, the sheriff explained, but there was no sign of forced entry, and Mr. Walsh was known to keep his office locked after business hours. Miss James had no explanation for how she got in. "Because the door was already open when I arrived," Violet whispered frantically to Timothy, who nodded and made a note. When Timothy's turn came to cross-examine the sheriff, he asked, Sheriff Miller, did you check for signs of entry through any other means? Windows, perhaps? The sheriff frowned. The windows were all secure. And did you find any blood trail leading away from the scene? Someone who stabbed a man multiple times would likely have blood on them. Well, no, Sheriff Miller admitted reluctantly, but Miss James had blood on her. On her hands and the front of her dress, Timothy clarified. Consistent with someone who found a wounded man and tried to help him, wouldn't you say? The sheriff's frown deepened. I suppose that's possible. When the prosecution rested its case, Timothy called his first witness, Yates Ellison. A murmur ran through the crowd as Yates made his way to the witness stand, his tall frame commanding attention. After being sworn in, he sat down, his posture straight and confident. Mr. Ellison, Timothy began, could you please tell the court where you were on the evening of May 15th, the night Edward Walsh was murdered? I was in town, Yates replied, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. I had come in to purchase supplies and decided to stay for dinner at the hotel restaurant. And what did you see that night? Yates shifted slightly, his eyes briefly meeting Violet's before returning to Timothy. After dinner, around 8 o'clock, I was walking back to my horse when I noticed Miss James heading toward Walsh's office. She seemed determined but not agitated. About 10 minutes later, as I was loading my supplies, I saw a man hurrying away from the direction of Walsh's office. He was moving furtively, keeping to the shadows. Parker was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. This witness has never mentioned seeing anyone else during his previous statements to the sheriff. Because the sheriff never asked, Yates replied calmly before the judge could respond. He'd already decided Miss James was guilty. Judge Harmon banged his gavel. Mr. Ellison, you will address your answers to counsel only. Mr. Parker, your objection is overruled, but I caution the witness to stick to factual observations. Did you recognize this man? Timothy continued. Yes, Yates said firmly. It was Thomas Reed. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Thomas Reed was Walsh's business partner, a man who had been notably absent from town since the murder, allegedly on a business trip to Tucson. That's preposterous, Parker exclaimed. Mr. Reed and Mr. Walsh were partners for 15 years. Your Honor, Timothy interjected, Mr. Parker is testifying, not questioning. Judge Harmon nodded. Sustained, Mr. Parker, you will have your opportunity to cross-examine. Mr. Ellison, Timothy continued, were you able to observe anything else about Mr. Reed that night? Yes, Yates replied, his gaze steady. He was carrying something wrapped in cloth. There appeared to be a dark stain spreading on the cloth. And he was wearing gloves despite the warm evening. Another murmur swept through the courtroom. Timothy allowed it to subside before asking his next question. What did you do after observing Mr. Reed? I followed him, Yates said. He went to the livery, saddled his horse, and rode out of town heading south. I was concerned by his behavior, so I trailed him for about a mile. He stopped at Creek Bend and threw something into the water. Then he continued south. Did you investigate what he might have thrown away? I did. The next morning, I returned to the spot and searched the creek. I found these. Yates reached into his pocket and produced a pair of leather gloves, stiff with dried blood. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Judge Harmon banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Parker was on his feet, protesting vehemently about evidence being introduced without proper channels. Your Honor, Timothy called over the noise, these gloves could prove my client's innocence. I request that they be examined for blood and compared to the blood of the victim. Judge Harmon considered for a moment, then nodded. I'll allow it. Sheriff, take possession of those gloves. As the sheriff moved to collect the evidence, Parker began his cross-examination, his voice tight with anger. Mr. Ellison, why didn't you come forward with this information immediately after the murder? I tried, Yates replied evenly. I went to the sheriff the next morning, but he informed me that he had already arrested Miss James and the case was closed. He wasn't interested in hearing alternatives. Sheriff Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat as several townspeople turned to look at him. And you expect us to believe that you, a newcomer to this town with barely any connection to the accused, took it upon yourself to conduct your own investigation? Parker's tone was scathing. Yates met his gaze unflinchingly. "I believe in justice, Mr. Parker. And I couldn't stand by watching an innocent woman being railroaded for a crime she didn't commit. How convenient that you alone saw this mysterious figure leaving the scene," Parker scoffed. "No one else has come forward with such observations." "Most folks were at the social at the church that night," Yates pointed out. "The street was nearly deserted, and people tend not to notice what doesn't concern them." Parker switched tactics. "What is your relationship with the accused, Mr. Ellison?" "We're neighbors," Yates replied simply. "Our properties share a boundary line." "Nothing more," Parker pressed, his implication clear. "We've spoken perhaps half a dozen times since I moved here," Yates said, a hint of irritation finally creeping into his voice. "But I know enough of her character to be certain she's not capable of murder." Parker's cross-examination continued for nearly an hour, but Yates remained steady in his testimony. When he was finally dismissed, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Timothy called Violet to the stand next, giving her the opportunity to tell her side of the story. "Miss James," he began gently, "could you please tell the court what happened on the night of May 15th? Violet took a deep breath, grateful for the chance to speak her truth at last. "After my father died, I discovered that Mr. Walsh held the mortgage on our ranch. He informed me that since the payments were 3 months in arrears, he would be foreclosing. I tried to negotiate with him, offering to work out a payment plan, but he refused. And what about on the night in question? I decided to make one final appeal," Violet explained. "I knew he often worked late in his office. When I arrived, the door was already open. I called out, but there was no answer, so I stepped inside." Her voice faltered. "That's when I found him, slumped over his desk, bleeding. I rushed to him, tried to help, but it was too late. I was still trying to stop the bleeding when Sheriff Miller arrived." "Did you see anyone else near the office that night?" Violet shook her head. "No, the street was quiet. Most people were at the church social." "Thank you, Miss James," Timothy said kindly before turning to Parker. "Your witness." Parker approached slowly, studying Violet as if she were a specimen under glass. "Miss James, you expect this court to believe that you just happened to find Mr. Walsh moments after he was stabbed. That this is all a terrible coincidence." "I'm telling the truth," Violet replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "The truth is that Walsh was foreclosing on your property, and you stood to lose everything," Parker countered. "The truth is that you were found with the murder weapon and the victim's blood on your hands." "I didn't kill him," Violet insisted, her voice firm despite the tears threatening to spill. "I had no reason to kill him. The foreclosure would proceed regardless of his death. Unless his papers were conveniently destroyed in the aftermath," Parker suggested, which, interestingly, they were. "His office was ransacked after his death." Violet frowned in confusion. "It wasn't ransacked when I was there," Parker pounced on her words. "So you admit the office was intact when you arrived, yet Sheriff Miller reported it was in disarray when he found you." "No," Violet said, struggling to make sense of this new information. "I mean, I didn't notice. I was focused on Mr. Walsh." Parker continued his aggressive questioning, trying to trip her up, but Violet maintained her innocence. When she was finally allowed to return to her seat, she felt drained but relieved to have told her story. The trial continued with Timothy calling several character witnesses who attested to Violet's honesty and gentle nature. Her nearest neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, testified that Violet had been caring for her after a fall earlier that day, only leaving around 7:30 that evening. "She mentioned going to speak with Mr. Walsh one more time," Mrs. Whitfield added. "She was nervous but determined. Not angry, not violent, just a young woman trying to save her home." As the day wore on, the mood in the courtroom began to shift. Doubt had been cast on the prosecution's neat narrative, and questions were being raised about Thomas Reed's suspicious absence. Just as Timothy was about to call his final witness, the doors to the courtroom burst open once again. This time it was Sheriff Miller's deputy, Frank Wilson, who entered, out of breath and wild-eyed. "Your Honor," he gasped, "we've found something." "Out at Creek Bend, just like Mr. Ellison said." Judge Harmon frowned at the interruption but motioned for the deputy to approach the bench. After a hurried conference, the judge addressed the court. "It appears that new evidence has come to light," he announced. "This court will recess until tomorrow morning while this evidence is examined." As the bailiff moved to escort Violet back to her cell, she caught Yates's eye across the crowded room. He gave her a small nod, a gesture of reassurance that somehow made her feel that, for the first time since this nightmare began, things might turn out all right. Back in her cell that evening, Violet was surprised when the sheriff himself came to speak with her. "Miss James," he began awkwardly, "I want you to know that we're reopening the investigation. Deputy Wilson found a saddlebag hidden under some rocks near where those gloves were recovered. Inside was a considerable sum of money and some papers from Walsh's office papers showing that Reed had been embezzling from their business for years." Hope surged through Violet. "Then you believe me, that I didn't kill Mr. Walsh?" Sheriff Miller had the grace to look ashamed. "I should have conducted a more thorough investigation. I apologize for that." After he left, Violet sat on her narrow cot, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. Her thoughts kept returning to Yates Ellison. Why had he gone to such lengths to help her? What had made him follow Reed that night? And why had he waited until the dramatic moment in court to reveal what he knew? The next morning, the courtroom was even more crowded than before. Word had spread about the new evidence, and speculation was rampant. When Judge Harmon called the court to order, he announced that Thomas Reed had been apprehended trying to cross into Mexico and was being returned to Redemption Springs to face questioning. Parker, looking considerably less confident than the previous day, requested a postponement of the trial pending further investigation. Judge Harmon agreed but added, "In light of the new evidence, I am releasing Miss James on her own recognizance. The charges against her will remain open until Mr. Reed has been questioned, but I see no reason to keep her confined." Relief washed over Violet like a cool rain after months of drought. As the bailiff removed her shackles, she heard the murmurs of the crowd, some apologetic, others still suspicious. She held her head high as she walked out of the courtroom, grateful but still aware that her ordeal wasn't entirely over. Outside, the bright Arizona sunlight momentarily blinded her. As her eyes adjusted, she became aware of someone standing nearby Yates Ellison, leaning against a hitching post, waiting. "Mr. Ellison," she said, approaching him, "I don't know how to thank you." His blue eyes studied her face. "No thanks necessary, Miss James. I couldn't let an innocent person be convicted." "But how did you know?" she asked. "About Reed, I mean." Yates glanced around, noting the curious onlookers. "Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more private." Violet nodded, suddenly aware of how dirty and tired she felt after days in jail. "I should go home first. I need to." She trailed off, overwhelmed by everything she needed to do: clean herself up, check on her neglected ranch, reassure her few remaining ranch hands that she was all right. "Of course," Yates agreed. "Would it be all right if I called on you tomorrow?" "I can explain everything then." "Yes, I'd like that," Violet replied, surprised by how much she meant it. True to his word, Yates arrived at Violet's ranch the following afternoon. She had spent the morning restoring order to her home and herself, washing away the grime of the jail cell and changing into a simple blue dress that had been her mother's. When she heard hoofbeats approaching, she stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the sun as she watched Yates ride up. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback, tying his horse to the hitching post before removing his hat as he approached the porch. "Miss James," he greeted her, a small smile softening his usually serious expression. "You're looking well." "Much better than the last time you saw me, I'm sure," she replied with a slight laugh. "Please come in, I've made coffee." Inside, the modest ranch house was clean and comfortable, if somewhat worn. Violet led him to the kitchen, where she poured 2 cups of coffee before sitting across from him at the sturdy wooden table. "Now," she said once they were settled, "I believe you owe me an explanation, Mr. Ellison." Yates wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, gathering his thoughts. I suppose I do. The truth is, I've been watching Thomas Reed for some time, not because of you, he added quickly, seeing her expression. Because of your father, Violet's brow furrowed. My father, I don't understand. I didn't come to Redemption Springs by chance, Yates explained. I was sent here by the Pinkerton Detective Agency. We had reports that someone in Walsh and Reed's company was involved in a land fraud scheme across several territories. Your father had written to our office shortly before his death, expressing suspicions about some of the loan papers he'd signed. Violet set down her cup with a sharp clink. You're a Pinkerton agent, not a rancher. I'm both, actually, Yates said with a slight smile. I grew up on a ranch in Colorado. The Pinkerton work came later. I buy small properties as part of my cover when I'm on an assignment. So my father suspected something was wrong with his loan? Violet asked, trying to process this new information. Yates nodded. He thought the interest rates had been changed after he signed the papers. He was right. Reed had been altering loan documents for years, charging higher rates and pocketing the difference. Walsh either didn't know or turned a blind eye. When your father died, Reed saw an opportunity to foreclose quickly and sell the land to the railroad for a considerable profit. The railroad. Violet repeated in surprise, but they're planning to build the line miles from here. That's what everyone believes, Yates confirmed, but there was a change in the survey. The new route would cut right through the eastern section of your property. Reed knew this because he had a contact in the railroad company. He and Walsh stood to make a fortune if they could acquire your land before the route was made public. Violet shook her head in disbelief. And you think Reed killed Walsh over this? I believe Walsh finally discovered what Reed had been doing and confronted him. The papers we found in the saddlebag included ledgers showing years of embezzlement, far beyond just your father's loan. Reed must have realized Walsh was going to expose him and acted in desperation. And I was the perfect scapegoat, Violet said bitterly. A woman alone with a public grudge against Walsh. I'm sorry, Yates said softly. I should have come forward sooner with my suspicions, but I needed proof, and I was still building my case against Reed when Walsh was murdered. Violet was quiet for a moment, processing everything she had learned. What happens now? With Reed, I mean, he'll stand trial for murder and fraud, Yates replied. The evidence against him is substantial. And as for your property, once the altered loan documents are presented in court, the bank will have to honor the original terms your father agreed to. Relief washed over Violet. Her home was safe. Her father's legacy would continue. Thank you, she said, meaning it more deeply than she could express. Not just for saving me from hanging, but for clearing my father's name. He was an honest man. It troubled me to think he might have mismanaged our affairs so badly. He spoke very highly of you in his letter, Yates said. He was proud of your strength and determination. Tears pricked at Violet's eyes. You met him, just once briefly, when I first arrived in town. He didn't know who I really was, of course, but he was friendly, offered advice about the local water rights, warned me about flash floods in the Arroyo. Yates smiled at the memory. He mentioned his daughter who could outride and outshoot most men in the territory. A laugh escaped Violet despite her tears. That sounds like him. He raised me to be independent, said I shouldn't have to rely on any man to take care of me. He was right, Yates agreed, though there's a difference between needing someone and choosing to have them in your life. Their eyes met across the table and something shifted in the air between them. Violet became acutely aware of how handsome Yates was, with his strong jaw and kind eyes. She looked away first, suddenly shy. Will you be leaving now? She asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Now that your case is solved, Yates hesitated. I should report back to the agency, but I'm not in any hurry. My assignment was to investigate the fraud, not just Reed. There may be others involved, so you'll stay in Redemption Springs, on your ranch, for a while at least, he confirmed. If that's all right with you, neighbor, Violet smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. More than all right, Mr. Ellison. Yates, he corrected gently. I think after everything that's happened, we can dispense with formalities. Yates, she repeated, liking the feel of his name, and I'm Violet. The weeks that followed brought dramatic changes to Redemption Springs. Thomas Reed was formally charged with the murder of Edward Walsh and a host of fraud-related crimes. The evidence against him was overwhelming, especially after several other landowners came forward with stories similar to Violet's father. As Yates had predicted, the bank was forced to honor the original terms of Joseph James's loan, securing Violet's ownership of her ranch. When the railroad's new route was publicly announced, property values in the area soared, but Violet had no interest in selling. The land had been in her family for 2 generations, and she intended to keep it that way. The townspeople, ashamed of how quickly they had judged her, made awkward attempts to make amends. Some brought food or offered help with ranch work, others simply stopped by to apologize. Violet accepted their gestures graciously, though she couldn't help but note that many who now sought her friendship had been among the most vocal in condemning her. Through it all, Yates remained a steady presence. He visited often, sometimes bringing supplies or offering help with ranch work, other times simply coming to share a meal and conversation. Violet found herself looking forward to his visits, enjoying his quiet humor and straightforward manner. On a warm evening in late June, nearly a month after her release, Yates arrived with a proposal. Violet had just finished her evening chores and was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson. "I've been thinking," he said after they had exchanged greetings, "your south pasture and my north field share that creek. It might make sense to build a joint irrigation system. It would benefit both our properties." Violet considered the idea. That could work. "The water rights are divided evenly along that stretch. We could start work next week if you're agreeable," Yates suggested. "I know a good stonemason in Tucson who could help with the channel construction." "I'd have to hire extra hands," Violet mused. "Most of my men left when." She trailed off, not wanting to revisit those dark days. "I know some reliable workers," Yates offered. "Men I've worked with before who need jobs." As they discussed the practical details of the project, Violet realized how natural it felt to plan and work together. Yates never spoke down to her or dismissed her ideas, treating her as a true partner in the endeavor. Later, as they shared a simple supper, Yates broached another subject. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," he said, his tone more serious. "I received a telegram from my supervisor at the agency yesterday." Violet's heart sank. She had been dreading this moment, knowing his work would eventually call him away. "You're leaving," she said, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. "Not exactly," he replied. "They've offered me a permanent position in this region. Overseeing investigations throughout the Arizona territory. I'd be based here but with occasional travel." Hope flared within her. "So you'd be staying, if I accept the position, yes?" He paused, studying her reaction. "I wanted to know how you would feel about that before I replied." Violet set down her fork, surprised by the question. "Why would my feelings matter in your decision?" Yates held her gaze steadily. "Because they matter to me, more than I expected them to when I first came here." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep within her. "I would be very glad if you stayed," she admitted softly. A smile spread across his face, transforming his serious features. "Good, because I've grown quite fond of this place and its people." The way he looked at her left no doubt as to which person in particular he meant. The irrigation project became the first of many joint ventures between their properties. As summer gave way to fall, Violet and Yates developed a routine of shared meals and long conversations on her porch or his. They talked about everything: her childhood on the ranch, his years working for the Pinkertons, books they had read, places they hoped to see. The townspeople quickly noticed their growing closeness. Gossip spread as it always did in small communities, but for once, Violet didn't mind being the subject of speculation. Let them talk. For the first time since her father's death, she was truly happy. October brought the Harvest Festival, an annual tradition in Redemption Springs. The town square was decorated with bunting and lanterns, and tables groaned under the weight of pies, cakes, and other homemade delicacies. A small band played lively tunes, and a dance floor had been set up in the center of the square. Yates arrived at Violet's ranch that evening to escort her to the festival. When she opened the door, he stood momentarily speechless. She had worn her best dress, a deep green that complemented her honey-brown eyes and brought out the auburn highlights in her dark hair, which she had arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. "You look beautiful," he said finally, offering his arm. Violet smiled, taking in his clean-shaven face and neatly pressed clothes. "You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Pinkerton." The festival was in full swing when they arrived. Heads turned as they made their way through the crowd, but the stares were curious rather than hostile now. Violet found herself greeting people warmly, even those who had been quick to believe the worst of her months earlier. "Would you care to dance?" Yates asked as the band struck up a waltz. Violet hesitated. "I haven't danced since before my father died." "Neither have I," he admitted. "But I think we can manage not to step on each other's toes too badly." She laughed and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor. His hand was warm at her waist, his touch respectful but firm as he guided her through the steps. They moved well together, finding a natural rhythm that made it seem as if they had danced together many times before. "This is nice," Violet said as they twirled past other couples. "I'd forgotten how much I enjoy dancing." "We should do it more often," Yates suggested, his eyes never leaving hers. "Do they hold many dances in the Arizona Territory that require the services of a Pinkerton detective?" she teased. "Perhaps not," he conceded with a smile. "But a man and his wife might find occasion to dance now and then, even without an official event." Violet nearly missed a step. "Wife," Yates guided her smoothly through a turn before responding. "I'm not proposing at a town festival, Violet. When I do, it will be somewhere private, somewhere meaningful to us both. I'm simply testing the waters." "And how do you find them?" she asked, her heart racing with a mixture of surprise and hope. "Promising," he replied, his smile widening. "Very promising indeed." The evening continued with more dancing, sampling of festival foods, and conversations with townspeople. As the night grew late, Yates suggested they step away from the noise for a few minutes. They walked to a quiet spot near the edge of the square where the lantern light barely reached and the stars shone brilliantly overhead. "I meant what I said earlier," Yates said softly, taking her hands in his. "Not about proposing tonight, but about my intentions. I care for you, Violet. More than I've cared for anyone in a very long time." Violet squeezed his hands gently. "I care for you too. These past months, you've brought light back into my life when I thought everything was darkness. We've both been alone for too long," he said. "I lost my family years ago, my parents to influenza, my brother in the war. I threw myself into my work because it was easier than building a life that could be taken away again." "I understand that fear," Violet admitted. "After my mother died, my father and I clung to each other. When I lost him too, I didn't think I could bear to open my heart again." Yates reached up to touch her cheek gently. "Yet here we are, she echoed, leaning into his touch, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. Yates lowered his head and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tender and questioning, but it sent warmth coursing through Violet's entire body. When they parted, she knew with absolute certainty that this was right, that he was right. They returned to the festival hand in hand, both aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. The evening continued with a new undercurrent of joy and anticipation of what was to come. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Violet's life. She and Yates spent as much time together as their work allowed, sharing meals, working side by side on their properties, and gradually weaving their lives together. They learned each other's habits and preferences, discovered shared interests, and navigated occasional disagreements with respect and care. In early December, as the first chill of winter settled over the territory, Yates invited Violet for a ride to a special place he had discovered on his property. They set out in the crisp morning air, following a trail that wound through stands of pine and juniper before emerging onto a high plateau overlooking the valley. "It's beautiful," Violet breathed, taking in the panoramic view. The distant mountains were capped with snow, and the valley below was a patchwork of ranches and natural landscapes. "I found it by accident one day when I was checking the property boundaries," Yates explained. "I've come here often to think." They dismounted and secured their horses, then walked to the edge of the plateau where Yates spread a blanket he had brought. From his saddlebag, he produced a small package wrapped in cloth. "I have something for you," he said, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. "It's not fancy, but I hope you'll like it." Violet unwrapped the cloth to find a small wooden box beautifully carved with a pattern of wildflowers around the edges. "Did you make this?" she asked, running her fingers over the intricate design. Yates nodded. "My father taught me woodworking when I was a boy. I've kept up the skill over the years, though I don't often have time for it." "It's exquisite," Violet said sincerely, touched by the personal nature of the gift. "Open it," Yates encouraged gently. Inside the box, nestled on a bed of soft fabric, was a simple gold band set with a small but perfect sapphire that caught the sunlight and gleamed like a piece of the sky. "It was my mother's," Yates explained softly. "The only thing of hers I kept after she died." Violet looked up at him, her eyes wide with emotion. "Yates." He took her hands in his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Violet James, these past months have shown me what I've been missing all these years: a home, a partner. A future filled with possibility instead of just duty. I love you, and if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Violet's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, I will marry you." Yates slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as if it had been made for her. Then he gathered her into his arms and kissed her, a kiss full of promise and shared dreams. When they finally parted, Violet rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never expected this," she admitted. "When I was standing in that courtroom, accused of murder, I thought my life was over, and now we begin a new chapter," Yates finished for her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Together." News of their engagement spread quickly through Redemption Springs. Most of the townspeople were genuinely happy for them, especially once the full story of how they had met and Yates's role in clearing Violet's name became widely known. It had all the elements of a romantic tale: false accusations, a brave defender, justice served, and love blossoming from adversity. They decided on a small wedding in early spring when the desert would be in bloom. In the meantime, there were practical matters to discuss: where they would live, how they would combine their ranching operations, what roles each would play in their shared enterprise. "We could build a new house," Yates suggested one evening as they sat by the fire in Violet's living room. "Something that's truly ours, not mine or yours," Violet considered the idea. "Where would we build it?" "There's that rise between our properties near the creek. It has a good view of both spreads, and it's a natural meeting point." "I like that," Violet agreed. "A fresh start in a home we create together." Winter passed in a flurry of planning for the wedding, for their future home, for the spring cattle drive they would undertake as a joint venture. Violet found herself busier than she had ever been, but happier too. Having a partner to share both the work and the rewards made everything more meaningful. The wedding took place on a perfect April day, with wildflowers carpeting the hills and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and pine. They exchanged vows under an arbor Yates had built, surrounded by a small gathering of friends and neighbors. Violet wore a simple white dress adorned with lace that had belonged to her mother, and Yates looked handsome in a new suit, his normally tanned face slightly flushed with emotion as he recited his vows. "I promise to stand by you always," he told her, his voice steady and sure. "Just as I stood for you when you needed someone most. To be your partner in all things, to share your joys and your sorrows, to build a life of purpose and love with you for all the days we are given." Violet's own vows came straight from her heart. "I promise to trust in you and in us, to face whatever comes with courage and faith, to remember always this gift: we have been given a second chance at happiness, a love born from the darkest moment of my life." As they sealed their promises with a kiss, Cheers erupted from their guests. The celebration continued into the evening, with food and music and dancing under the stars. When they finally retired to Violet's house, their temporary home, until the new one was completed, they were exhausted but blissfully happy. "Mrs. Ellison," Yates said softly as he closed the bedroom door behind them. "I like the sound of that," Violet smiled, reaching up to loosen his tie. "So do I, Mr. Ellison, so do I." The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Their new house was completed by late summer, a spacious but comfortable home built with love and attention to detail. They combined their herds and lands into a single, thriving operation that became one of the most successful in the territory. Yates continued his work with the Pinkertons, though he was more selective about the cases he took, preferring those that kept him close to home. Violet managed the ranch with skill and determination, earning respect throughout the region for her business acumen and innovative approaches to cattle breeding. Their first child, a daughter they named Alina after Violet's mother, arrived a year after their wedding, bringing new joy and deepening their bond. A son, Joseph, named for Violet's father, followed 2 years later. Their family was completed with the birth of twins, Michael and Margaret, in the spring of 1884. Through the years, they never forgot how their story began with an accusation, a brave stand for justice, and a love that grew from the most unlikely of circumstances. They told their children the story as they grew older, emphasizing the importance of truth, courage, and standing up for what is right even when it isn't easy. Thomas Reed was convicted of murder and fraud, sentenced to life in prison where he died of pneumonia 3 years into his sentence. Edward Walsh's widow eventually sold their business and moved east, but not before apologizing to Violet for her husband's role in the fraudulent scheme that had nearly cost Violet her ranch and her life. Redemption Springs grew and prospered as the railroad brought new opportunities and settlers to the region. The Ellison Ranch expanded accordingly, becoming a cornerstone of the local economy and a model of sustainable ranching practices. On warm summer evenings, Violet and Yates often sat on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set behind the mountains. In those quiet moments, they would sometimes reflect on the strange and winding path that had brought them together. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Violet asked one such evening, leaning against Yates's shoulder as they watched 7-year-old Alina teaching 4-year-old Joseph how to lasso a fence post. "If you hadn't been in town that night, if you hadn't seen Reed." Yates tightened his arm around her. "I try not to dwell on might-have-beens, but I do thank whatever fate or providence put me in the right place at the right time." "As do I," Violet agreed, turning to kiss his cheek, "every single day." The sound of childish laughter drew their attention back to the yard, where the twins, now toddlers, were attempting to follow their older siblings' example with pieces of rope far too big for their small hands. "I should help before they tangle themselves up completely," Yates said with a chuckle, rising from his seat. Violet watched as he joined their children, patiently demonstrating the proper technique for holding a lasso. His face was more weathered now, with lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But he was still as handsome to her as he had been that day in the courtroom when he had stood up and changed her life forever. As twilight deepened into night, they gathered their children and moved inside. The nightly ritual of baths, stories, and tucking in was a cherished part of their routine, one that reinforced the bonds of their family. Later, when the house was quiet and they had retired to their own room, Yates took Violet's hand, running his thumb over the wedding band that accompanied her mother's sapphire ring. "Happy?" he asked, as he often did, his eyes searching hers. "Completely," she assured him, meaning it as much now as she had the first time he'd asked on their wedding night. "You, more than I ever thought possible," he replied, drawing her close. "You know, there are times when I'm working a case or riding the property or even just watching you with the children, and I'm struck by how fortunate I am. How close we came to never having this." Violet nestled against him, grateful for his steady heartbeat under her ear. but we did find it. Against all odds, he echoed, pressing a kiss to her hair. And I wouldn't change a single moment of our journey, not even the darkest parts, because they led us here. As they drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, Violet's last conscious thought was one of profound gratitude for second chances, for justice served, for a love that had begun with a simple act of courage and grown into the foundation of a life more beautiful than she could have imagined. In the years to come, their story would be passed down through generations, not just within their own family, but throughout Redemption Springs and beyond. It became a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope can be found, that justice can prevail, and that love can bloom in the most unexpected circumstances. And it all began with a falsely accused woman and a cowboy who stood up and said, "I'll testify for her."